at the beginning. Yeah.
Okay. Let people trickle in shortly.
Ooh.
Let me know whenever you want me to start.
That's good.
Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Michelle. The numbers are like steadily increasing. Yeah, I think we can get started now. We're recording, so like if anyone comes a little bit late, they can just watch the beginning on YouTube.
All right. Okay. Cool. Hi guys. I'm super excited to be here today. My design career started with IDEATE, so I'm super excited to kind of be here and share my design process with all of you. For a bit of background on me, my name is Shreya. I graduated from Duke in 2019, and I'm currently based in San Francisco working as a product designer at Uber. I work on Uber's Rider Labs team, where we create MVP products at scale to test the ideas of the future of rider mobility. And so today what I'd like to share is an idea that's really close to my heart, and it's one of my guiding principles for design, which is trust and empathy. So before we start talking about designing for trust and what that really means, I want to do a quick 30-second exercise first. So I've only done this in person. I've never done this over Zoom, but hopefully this goes well. I want everyone right now to put their first ever screen name in the chat. So whatever it was, and I'll do mine as well. But just put it in the chat right now. Let me see if I can put mine too. I don't know if I can. Oh, there we go. You guys are gonna laugh at me, but that's what it's meant to do. Okay. I love these.
Yo, some of these are pretty normal.
I know, a lot of these are normal, which is very weird. Mine was World Rocks 10, guys. Come on, there's something. Mad Mango, there we go, okay. But anyway, so what I wanted to kind of establish there was that tiny sense of panic that you felt with that exercise is kind of a small window into vulnerability that users actually feel. And so in the case of any product, what I want you to think about is that people are opening themselves up to a new platform, and it's kind of our job as designers to make sure that we identify the areas where they can potentially feel vulnerable. And so identifying this vulnerability is kind of what allows us to build trust and open conversations with our users. And so when users choose to trust, they're essentially choosing to take a risk, right? And so another fun fact about this exercise, if you ever want to do it again, when I did it, I was asked to unlock my phone and hand it to the person next to me without any introductions. So that was like a whole other sense of panic, but given Zoom, this is what we did. Cool. So trust is kind of at the idea, it's the core of an exchange between any interaction, as in social and economic interactions, and our ability to trust is determined by our ability to kind of see other people's perspectives. And because we're able to consider the thoughts and feelings of others, we're enabled to continue the cycle of trust. And so at its core, trust is about empathy. And that brings me to a bigger question of this entire thing is empathy is a word that's been thrown around a lot in design, but what does it really mean? So this is a trend that I wanted to show you of the usage of the word empathy since 2004, according to Google Trends. It's great that empathy is resonating with so many people, but for designers, the problem then becomes, how do we turn this talk into action? So at the core of that is understanding who you're designing for, recognizing that people come from different cultures and different backgrounds and they have different needs will help you understand the situation that you're kind of designing in. And even if you don't live their lives, you can watch and listen and then learn from them. And so an exercise for building this muscle that you can do even at home is think about the mindset of the first person that you might interact with every day, whether it's the barista at your local cafe, or if it's a coworker over Zoom, or if it's someone walking their dog. Think about what their story is, what their needs and wants might be, and how they're responding to their environment or how their environment is responding to them. So think about what it would be like to kind of walk or sit or stand in the shoes of that person, what you think you would feel, and what you can learn from imagining their experience. And by asking these questions slowly, you'll be able to develop the ability to see things from another person's perspective, which is really at the core of what empathy is. And so to understand this a little bit more, I wanted to give you an example of Google's infamous cupcake example. And if you aren't familiar with this feature, Google tested a feature a couple of years ago that estimated how many calories someone would burn by walking a route, represented in the form of these pink mini cupcakes. As you can imagine, this was not well received because an ostensible measure to promote health was interpreted as a tech company policing women's bodies. And I say women specifically because of what the pink frosting signifies. And not only this, the average body type that was used to come up with the calculation wasn't disclosed by the company. And as we know, there's really no one size fits all for health. But something to learn from this is that as our behavior is kind of shaped more by our interactions with our phone, and our health is shaped by the world that comes to us through the screen and the products that we use, the effects will be beneficial or otherwise, but they will never be neutral, as demonstrated by this example. And I think that's the most important thing to remember here, is that this extends further than just health products, but to behavior in general. So for designers, that means that you have the responsibility of finding ways to promote these positive experiences without compromising any individual's sense of agency. And imagine how different things could have gone if designers had gone straight to the source, the experts in the field, and asked for their participation and guidance from ideation through launch. If they had tested this with a base of users, they would have gotten very clear signal that this was probably not a good idea to launch. So in other words, if the team had designed with their users instead of for them. And so the idea of designing with your users is less about maximizing accommodation, and it's more about minimizing alienation. So it means taking steps to ensure that your design process holds you accountable for the human that's behind the user, and it helps you understand why users are doing a certain thing. So if you take Uber, for example, our users fall into a variety of different categories. So for our driver partners, for example, we've got part-time drivers who are driving for pocket money, drivers who are on the platform because it's their full-time job, and drivers who just signed up because they enjoy meeting new people. And so then the question we try to answer becomes, how do we spread belonging and create a platform that addresses the needs of these different user types? And how do we make that experience as stress-free as possible, so that our driver partners always feel like they're in control of the time on their platform? And this is a really important piece to consider, because Uber, without the trust of our driver partners, we obviously really wouldn't have a product. So the other part of designing for trust is realizing that designers have the power to demonstrate visions of what the future looks and feels like. And the clearer that we get with that vision, the more precise we get articulating it, the easier it is for people to absorb it, right? And demonstrating the vision of the future means designing for the people that are actually in those futures. And that means creating visibility within an experience. So the user should never feel like she is not in control, and at no point in the experience should the information be inconsistent with user expectations. So if we go back to the Google cupcake example, the cupcake was definitely not within user expectations when they opened up a map and tried to get directions for walking to whatever place they needed to go. Despite a surge in Fitbits and fitness apps a couple of years ago, many people still didn't want to be reminded of calories unless they had requested to. So in this case, unsolicited calorie counts and cupcake equivalents had an air of policing that was not expected of the user. That, and the lack of a disable button or the choice to change the type of food to anything else that resonated more with the user, led to a feeling of the user not being in control. And so while it's safe to assume here that Google was not out to shame or trigger users with their cupcakes, it clearly failed to test this new feature with a representative user base. And so to this end, as far as products go, designers should always aim to test the experience of a product. And when you're testing experience with people, the goal on top of any metrics that you're tracking should be to understand how your product makes people feel when they use it, because people will always remember a feeling. You should aim also to test often and test broad. And in a room of people of all different functions, your job as a designer is to advocate for the user's needs in that room. And you obviously won't get it right 100% of the time. I mean, nobody does, but that's why you need to test and iterate and have people who are familiar with the field, your users, as part of your development process from the very beginning. And so moving fast and breaking things is a phrase that we hear a lot in tech and in startups and in Silicon Valley. But in a world where this has become the product process mantra, it doesn't mean that you can't move fast. It just means that you're likely to do more good and, more importantly, cause less harm if you slow down where it counts and think about your users. So you can start by focusing on where your business needs and your user needs overlap and build out from there. But by doing one thing well first, instead of creating irresponsibly designed MVPs, you will start engineering thoughtfulness into a process where failing fast could have potentially critical consequences. And so the other thing I wanted to mention was that it's not just harmful for your users. If you're considering the business case, irresponsibly designed MVPs are harmful from a business perspective as well. The negativity bias is something that we use at Uber, and it's something that tells us that users value negative experiences at approximately 4 times the rate of positive experiences. So that means that it takes 4 good product experiences to equal a single bad experience. And so this implies that the return from perfecting user flows to eliminate negative experiences outweighs implementing innovative but unpolished products. And also, not to mention, the long-term retentions create an evolving trust in the brand with your users. So from both the user and the business perspective, it's good to think about your users from the very beginning of your product process. To kind of drive home the point of user testing and understanding why it's important to design with your users, I wanted to bring your attention to this example of why good and thoughtful design is important. This is from a book called Tragic Design, and there's multiple other examples in this book, but this is one where the software very clearly violates simple and basic rules of usability. The information density is really high that you can't scan for critical information. And here it's very clear that any simple user testing would have helped identify common errors that the nurses were making, like the fact that they couldn't read the alerts that were happening on the screen. So a simple matter of adjusting visual hierarchy based on user feedback could actually be the difference between life and death, which is something that, this is like a very extreme case, but unfortunately it's not one that happens as rarely as we think. So this is why designers are so badly needed in healthcare or public service or other fields that are critical to people's well-being. And these incidents are, again, they're not few. There have been incidents of plane crashes, of Ebola patients being sent home accidentally, or of cancer patients receiving almost 20 times the radiation dosage that they were required, which all of them obviously led to fatal consequences. But on the bright side, at its best case scenario, design can empower people. And I think there's no better example of a platform that creates trust through design than Airbnb. So they've opened new experiences to people across the globe, and they've allowed for authentic and meaningful relationships to be built through a thoughtfully designed platform. Airbnb recognizes that sharing your home is as personal as it gets. So getting over 600,000 people to open their homes to complete strangers is an incredible feat. And that was only achieved by designing for trust in their community. So how did they do this? So they identified that there is a connection between the transaction that powers the sharing economy. And to deepen this connection, the company hosts something called Airbnb Open every year, which is a conference designed by Airbnb to engage and learn from their hosts, and for hosts to learn from each other. And so creating this level of engagement promotes a sense of trust. And as humans, we're obviously wired to trust people and platforms that we have a personal connection with. There's actually many other examples of how Airbnb designs for trust. A lot of them can be found from their website or from Joe Gebbia's TED Talk, but this is, I think, one of the more powerful ways that they've been able to do this. So I think in the context of Uber, designing for trust has been crucial to my role, and designers can often think about the case where the experience goes perfectly. So when the rider books a trip, gets a ride, finds the driver seamlessly, and reaches her destination effortlessly. But what about the case when things don't go as planned? For example, what if the driver cancels, or if the rider is charged extra, or if the rider wants to cancel a ride that hasn't arrived yet? So at Uber, we call this non-happy paths, and this is when users have an issue and we try and provide neutral and immediate feedback to help them solve this issue. So overlooking these non-happy paths kind of results in dead ends that happen really late, and it takes away energy that riders could otherwise have applied to reordering their ride. And dead ends are often seen as failures to the user. They often ask themselves, did I do something wrong? And we never want users to ask this question, right? Because it's the fault of poor design. It's never the fault of our users. Whenever they make a mistake, it's always something in the experience that has led them down that path to make that mistake. And so these dead ends also, again, they impact both our users and our business, because users choose to move on to a different platform, not having trust in the experience and not having trust that they could probably do it again without a mistake. And businesses lose a customer that could have been retained with just a little bit of thoughtful design. So there's a simple framework that I use to identify where I am on this continuum of recognition at the start of a project. I'll let you guys look at this for a second and kind of explain it in a bit. But this was something that was introduced to me really early in my design career, and it's something that's stuck with me ever since I have become aware of it. What it translates to is that young designers often tend to overestimate their ability to understand their users. So on this curve, they're kind of faced with unconscious incompetence, which is the peak of the very first peak that you're seeing. And as you become more experienced, you're able to truly recognize that you are not your user, and realize the areas that you kind of have to dig around to get to the plateau of sustainability that's at the very end, which is where you want to be, which is knowledge and cognition on a high level. So in other words, you kind of transition to having some level of conscious incompetence, which is always obviously a lot better. But getting to that level of separation and understanding that you are not your user is something that I'm still working towards, but it's an incredibly valuable skill to have and to kind of work to. And then one way to get to this is, one way to start approaching this idea is understanding the scope of what you don't know when you start a project. So when you start a project, you have an idea of the general information that you are confident that you actually do know, which is this little box that you're seeing. And then you're also aware that you have a lot of things that you have to research and figure out and try and understand, which is the second box, which is the areas that you think that you don't know. But thoughtful design happens when you recognize and act on this third component, which is the unknown unknowns. And this is where observing, learning, and designing with your users actually plays a really big role. Okay, so having said all of this, your job as a designer is to sift through all the information that you collect from your users and uncover the layers that are rarely able to articulate their emotional connection to a problem. Instead, their frustration shows up at the surface level. They'll talk about a button, or they'll talk about the text not being correct. But if a problem seems tougher than that, odds are that there's more to it than you actually think. So your goal is to uncover the emotional resistance and then work to address that specifically. So I'll leave you with an example to end, and you guys can kind of work through this after I finish my talk. For example, so simplifying a checkout flow isn't going to help much if the user is afraid that they're making a bad purchase, right? So the question that I want to end with is, how do you go about building trust with the user so they actually have confidence in that purchase? And it could be a nice design exercise for you guys to do, or something along those lines. But that was the end. Thank you guys for listening. These are all the ways you can contact me. I'm more than happy to help or talk about design or whatever. My email, my Twitter, my LinkedIn, and my website are all up here for you guys to contact me whenever you'd like. But if there's questions or if you guys have comments, I'm happy to stick around for the next like 10 minutes and answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shreya. Your talk was super inspiring. And I think, yeah, like someone said in the comments too, I think it was really important how you talked about more of this like ethical side of design and really designing for users. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to type it into the chat. And yeah, we have about 10 minutes, I think. So yeah, ask her anything.
Oh, I like that someone said people forget about the ethical side of design. Yes, they do.
And yes, we will be posting the recording on YouTube. Yeah. I guess I can ask a quick question, but yeah, I guess kind of when thinking about like designing ethically and really like designing for your users, do you have a specific framework that you use with the products you build, or is it kind of, is there like a checklist of things, or is it more of just like part of the entire design process for you?
So I think it's more like I wouldn't say it's a checklist, but it's more considering with every design change that you make what the effect is going to be on the user and their environment. So within the flow of whatever product you're designing, how will the user react to each state that you put in? And the way to think about that is not only like thinking if they do everything correctly, but also if they make an error, if they make a mistake, how does that reflect on their experience and where it takes them back into the flow. So I'll give you an example. Like for Uber, when we designed the experience for when a rider cancels a ride, we actually don't take them back so if they cancel the ride, we don't take them back to like the beginning screen where it's like asking them where to. We put them back into the product selector because our hypothesis is that they will want to rebook their ride without having to retype in their destination. So it's like things like that to consider, is to like, how do you kind of build that more unconscious or subtle level of trust that exists where the user knows that it's okay for them to like take an action and go back to a step that they are familiar with.
Yeah, that makes sense.
How does design style play into user trust? Do they prefer simpler designs, dynamic designs, or does it depend on user space? That's a really good question. I think something to consider here is you don't ever want to change the actions of the user too much. So like if you are creating, I don't know, if you're creating like a shopping app, you want to use interactions that the user is familiar with. So like obviously they know that like pinching to zoom is something that they always do, or like they know that certain icons mean certain things, but you never want to reinvent the wheel of what they know to be true, because that just places a lot of cognitive load on the user, and they won't be able to understand like where they're supposed to go. So kind of using existing design systems from a cohort of other apps that exist or products that exist, and using that to create your product versus like trying and reinventing everything and playing into the existing usability principles is kind of where I would start. And obviously I would always argue that it's better to keep things simpler versus more and try and like really ask yourself with every piece of information or component that you put on an interface, does it really need to be there, and what purpose it serves. I hope that helps. do you choose the users first or a problem first? How do you identify problems that they experience if you are not the user? This is also a good question. So you kind of look at a problem space, and what you start with always is a hypothesis, right? So you kind of look at a problem space and you're like, okay, our hypothesis is that this is a problem because of XYZ. And then you go in, and that's when you test, and you actually test if that's a problem. And that's where user research really comes into play. So for my team, for example, we test MVP products, which means we don't actually idea of an MVP, right? Is you understand kind of the bucket of users that you're designing for, and you get a bit of a signal of, yes, this is something that people want, by doing like surveys or bringing in focus groups or just looking at general data that people have kind of been inputting. And from there, you go and test the product and you see how people are reacting to it. Like, are they actually booking the trip? Are they actually staying on the platform long enough to book a trip, or where's the drop off happening? And that's what gives you signal as to whether or not this is this is a solution that you want to pursue. So I would always say, like, it starts with a hypothesis of what you think the problem is, and then once you gather research from your users, it will inform your decision of whether or not that is actually the correct hypothesis, or whether your problem has to kind of shift that into something that's more deeper. So you always want to keep asking why to kind of get to the bottom layer of what you're truly designing for, versus staying at the surface level and not uncovering the areas that users actually have a problem with, or the space that actually needs to be solved. Where do you think is the border between making it easier for the user to use a product and manipulating them to doing whatever the business side wants them to do? Using some dark patterns, whether you think it's acceptable at some stages or in some products. That's a really good question. I think that's something that so basically the question is, dark patterns in user experience are when the designers intentionally lead users down a path that is not beneficial for them, and that's beneficial more for the business and for getting them to do what the business wants. And ideally, in an ideal world, that would never happen, and users would always go down a path that is beneficial for them. But because of I guess because of like business needs, there are some cases where they do get led down thing that exists. But I don't know. I think for me, it really depends on what the trade-off is between leading them down that dark path and kind of creating the experience that is probably the best experience for the user. I would say that I would ideally not like to lead them down a dark path, but if it's like an ask that's coming from, depending on who it's coming from on my team, there's always a case of who is this being designed for. So especially at Uber, like when we design with like our ops team and our be more beneficial for like the ops people or for the riders, and which kind of, who do you consider more basically. So it becomes more of a game of like, which one are you trying to focus on more, which part of the diagram are you actually trying to design for. And if it's a case where like the business really needs to make money or they really need to get users, I would say there is still a way to find a trade-off between doing both, but it's definitely a really hard question to answer, and I can't, I will never go out and say like you should lead them down dark paths. This is kind of a big question on the topic of ethics. When you design with users, how do you center racial and gender equity, safety, and justice? I think that's what I was talking about in terms of you want to kind of minimize alienation that anyone feels. So including every single bucket of users in your tests and in your surveys, and considering all the different people that this product could potentially reach, is a way that you can kind of center your product around these people. And another way to do that is just like being aware of your surroundings and being aware of the context that you're in and the environment that you're in and the potential consequences that designing any kind of product can have on people. And I would almost go as far to say that if you think something is an edge case, it's more likely than not that it's not actually that much of an edge case, and you should really consider it. So a lot of times I've seen in design, like people will say, oh, this is an edge case, we don't really have to think about it for MVP, we can think about it later. But what actually happens is that it's not as much of an edge case as we thought, and you come back and you realize, oh crap, like I actually have to design for this because people are doing this action more than I thought, or there's like more people of this type that are using our product. And so I would always treat an edge case with a little bit of salt and actually create some kind of scenario and play that scenario out to see what that consequence is. And I think the other thing is you can do a lot with text and with copy. So humanizing your copy on any product that you have will always make an impact on the user. Having a conversation with them versus saying something that's more monotonous or in a robotic tone is something that creates, it makes you feel safer, and it kind of creates that connection with your users versus kind of using something that's more generic and not really it's not really transformed for your different users that exist. Is Facebook an example of such what? Can you please specify? Sorry. What is the difference between different design roles? Product designer, UX designer, interaction designer. Okay, yeah. So as you kind of figure out what part of the design process you actually want to fit into, a product designer is more someone, I would say, that I understands where your business needs and your user needs kind of exist and finds that overlap between the two of them to actually create a product that fits both of these cases. So you work a lot with like product managers and you work a lot with your engineers, and it's more of like a full full end-to-end designer. But at the same time, you don't really do, it depends. Like at a lot of companies, like they're called product designers, and you work from the research phase through to the actual like development phase. A UX designer, I would almost go to say, is the same thing. It's just like been evolved in names over the past couple of years. I know an interaction designer is very specifically focused on like micro interactions. So those little features of delight that you see in a certain product. So for example, on Facebook, like the React buttons, like when they do that little like animation when you react, that's kind of like the idea of like a delight feature that interaction designers really focus on. So I would say that's like a little bit more visual, and it's more like an animation kind of focused role, but also like a very important part of the design process. There's also like motion designers, visual designers, and then people at the start that are like user researchers that last through the entire process. So it's really figuring out like what area interests you and kind of diving deep into that area and being able to articulate that this is the part of the design process that you enjoy and that you really want to work on. Speaking of edge cases, how do you identify what features should be included in an MVP? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think putting ideas in, so trying to figure out the scope of an MVP is kind of like trying to, it's a fine balance between trying to figure out what is actually feasible to build for a given timeline and what areas are you have to focus on for your users. So if you think that there's something in there that is crucial for your users to know or your users to experience for an MVP and for people to actually really experience the full product, you should really push for that to be in your MVP idea, even if your engineers push back on you and say, no, we can't build this. The reason for that is like an MVP is supposed to give you signal on whether or not this product works, right? So if you're stripping back a lot of the features that actually make your product great, it's going to give you a poor signal because you're not actually going to be shipping like a version of the product that is reflective of what you want it to be. And so for that, I would say you want to create something that gives your users enough of a signal that this is what this experience is. And if you see like negative reactions, or if you see people not using it in the way that you expected, pull it off the market, because you don't want people to use a bad experience and then associate that product with your brand and then stop trusting your brand and stop using your product. So I think identifying features kind of it comes in a couple of ways. Like you have to work with obviously like the rest of your team to figure out what they think is useful. So work with like your business development people and like your PMs and everything. And then think about what success looks like. So always think about, this product is going to be successful if we see this action by the user, or if we see the user do XYZ. And that will always inform like what your North Star is and what your anchor is for using for building this product. So then when you have that idea of what success is, you'll never stray away from it, and you always create components and parts of the experience that fall within that category to get your user to that idea of success. I hope that answered your question. I sent the Facebook question when you were speaking about businesses manipulating users into doing what they want them to do. Yeah, I would to an end say that Facebook is probably like I don't know if it's like manipulating users into doing what they want them to do, but maybe ads and products like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, places where you consume a lot of news, they have a big say in like what you identify as being your window into reality. So like whatever news they present is like what you're really consuming on a daily basis, because by nature we spend a lot of time on these products. So I think their dark patterns come more from they have the responsibility of shaping what people believe to be true from what they're surfacing on their feeds, and kind of designing for making sure that what people are consuming is actually what is actually what is reflected in the world is kind of their responsibility. And that's where I would say like they need to do some work on is kind of identifying that how they best articulate that window to all of their users. But yeah, these were great questions, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Shreya. I think we're probably gonna wrap it up. Maybe if you want to join the Slack, like people could ask you questions there too. But yeah, thank you so much again.
Of course, thank you guys for hosting this.
Of course, yeah. And for everyone logistics wise, we're having our like last set of workshops starting in just a few minutes. So feel free to, I guess, just stay on this link for, I think, our storytelling workshop. And then we have another workshop on IDEATE 3. So yeah, thank you all.
All right, thanks guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.